And so we've hit the 1 o'clock mark. So we are going to go ahead and start this presentation. For everyone that wasn't here for our conversation before, this is a brand new platform that we're using, Webinar TV. It's obviously got its kinks, because if you have received multiple emails in the lead up to this, too many as reminders, pop that in the chat so we know about it. But we will hopefully get on top of that as an issue. The recording of this will be sent out to everybody after we conclude this webinar, and we've got additional things to share with you that will help make this webinar even more powerful in your practice moving forward. Now, Amina is going, because I will lose your faces in a sense when I start sharing my screen, Amina is going to sing out anytime someone's got a question or she would like to contribute. Ella said, I certainly was reminded. How reminded do you want to be? How stupid do you think I am that I can't pick up on the fact that the webinar is happening today?
Big apologies, Ella. It's very annoying.
Very, very annoying. And so we'll go ahead and start sharing. And the topic of full screen mode. The topic of today's webinar is super important. This is one of Amina's little habits. She loves doing this. The minute we get into a dental practice, one of the first things she does is database discovery. Amina, tell us a little bit more why that's the case.
I often find in dental practices, people think that the recall system or the incomplete treatment processes are being managed, and they do take care of these duties and think that they're doing their absolute best to make sure these things are taken care of. However, what I find is that they don't quite understand how the software works and what reports and things to look for to make sure that these things are indeed functioning well. In turn, the result to the business or the practice, should these things not be looked after well, is that you're missing out on business, that the books could be quiet, people aren't as busy, or their appointment book isn't as full as it could be. And there is a little bit of a process to learning how to manage the database very, very well to get the best out of it for your practice.
And quite often we get the query, I'm not turning over enough, or I don't have enough new patients, or I've got a gappy appointment book, and so I just need to do some more marketing, where in actual fact, all of the consultants, over in America, in the UK, here in Australia, all tend to say the same thing. First of all, have a look what's already in your database. But it takes a bit of skill to find out where this information is being housed and how it's processed too as well, Meanie. Yeah.
Yeah, and where all the mistakes are happening. And sometimes it could be a software issue. And sometimes it could be a systems and strategies and processes, lack of staff training issue, or a lack of knowledge to even know where to start looking for these things in the first instance. So lots of different things could be happening, and I think this is an area that everyone should be investing some time and, if needed, a bit of money to make sure that this is being managed well.
Beautiful, beautiful. So initially, give us a 1 minute grab about who you are, Amina.
I'm wonderful. I've been working in dentistry for almost 30 years. Hi, Diane. Hi, Kelly. So I was brought up in a country town where my father was a GP, so I was quite familiar with a medical practice, and later got into dentistry as a dental assistant. I wasn't that keen on the whole idea. It was just that it was the only job going in the whole town, and I stumbled across it, as many of us do. And I did that for some time before later venturing into reception and practice management. I became very interested in accounting and how to make practices viable, and probably a big part of that interest developed from my father, who was a very devoted doctor, but not a very good businessman. So I realised that people who really loved these science types of occupations were devoted to that clinical aspect, but they weren't really educated and sometimes not even that interested in the business side. And that's where my passion grew to help people in that area.
Beautiful, beautiful. And very quickly about myself, again, like Amina, worked in dental surgeries and all the non-practitioner roles through a high number of years. When I was 33, became the first non-dentist to buy a practice in Australia and loved that for 10 years, then became a dental practice management consultant. And a few years into my consultancy, Amina reached out as a consultant as well by then, and we formed Dental Business Mastery. Slowly but surely, we've become one single entity. And so we do deliver one-on-one practice management programs, consulting programs to help dental practices achieve any of their goals. And we also do a lot of online courses for practice managers, receptionists, new grads, dentists, and we have a membership as well called The Club, which is a whole bunch, over 100 training videos that's added to that library all the time as well. So we've got various ways of helping you out, and that dentalbusinessmastery.com.au website, which we'll remind you about again at the end, is a great place to go to find out exactly how we can help you. So let's get into the guts of the topic, which is why you're forsaking your lunch break to be able to be here today. What makes up your database? What we mean by database is, of course, your patient list. Every single patient nowadays that's moved through your practice will be in your database. Gone are the days where they're all on card files. So I think we're safe to say nowadays that every patient that's moved through your dental practice is in your database. And what makes up your database are two things, both active patients, those that are coming back for recalls all the time. They might be mid-treatment. They may not ever kind of come back in for checkups and cleans, but they're in the middle of a root canal because they had a toothache, for example. And inactive patients. And then within those two categories of active patients and inactive patients, these are the people who are in your database. With your active patients, they are either in the schedule. So they're booked in today or sometime in the future. It could be for advised treatment, or it could be in a few months' time for their recall appointment time. It could be for their first new patient appointment time coming up. They're either in the schedule or they are in the recall process. So they haven't got an appointment time booked as yet, but they are in your recall process. They will be sent a reminder in some form at some stage to book in for their general checkup and clean. Also within your active patients are those who have incomplete treatment. So they have had treatment presented to them, but for whatever reason, they haven't booked in as yet. They're all your active patients. Then we flip over to your inactive patients. And these patients are the transients. And so we're going to talk a little bit about categories of patients, but what transient patients are, we all know who they are. They ring up for an appointment time. They usually say something like, I haven't been in for 15 years and I've got a toothache. And they come in and then you get them out of pain. You may have advised some treatment or advised for a recall, but you know they're never going to possibly book in for that. And so they usually form part of your inactive patient base in your database. They're a whole bunch of transients. It's just not in their routine to manage their oral health. Also in your inactive patient area is the gone elsewhere. So they used to come and see you, but for whatever reason, they are now seeking treatment somewhere else. And so they're not responding to recall reminders. They don't really read your newsletters or those sort of things, but because they've gone somewhere else. The other ones that are residing in your inactive patient base are either moved away or passed away. So they've moved out of the area, so no matter how much promotion you do, they're now in another state or in another country and they won't be returning to you, or they've passed away and simply cannot return to you. So when we talk about database discovery, we're talking about this collection of people, and the discovery portion is identifying which ones amongst this all of the people within your database, which ones can we reactivate in some way, tap into in some way, because it could have been a software issue, the way we input data and patient information into the software. For some reason, they've dropped off the recall list. For some reason, they're not booking in for their incomplete treatment. For some reason, they have gone somewhere else. And so we want to have a look at, before we start casting our eyes outward, we just need to do more marketing to bring more new patients in. We want to cast our eyes inward and say, well, what have we already got that we're missing out on? The untapped gold mine that might be in your practice, and as you can appreciate and have probably assumed yourselves already, the percentage of your database that makes up that they're not booking in for recalls, that they have incomplete treatment, that they haven't booked in for, and that are inactive, it depends wildly on your location, on how long your practice has been around for, how much nurturing of your existing patient base that you do. It depends on a whole raft of things. But the figures that are kind of generally out there are that 20 to 50% of your patient base don't actively book in for recalls. They're not coming in every 6 months for recalls. It's just not the way that they manage their oral care. 10 to 15% have incomplete treatment. And there were other figures that I saw that up to 50% of people that are suggested to have treatment done never actually book in for it. So it ends up being around 10 to 15% of your patient base have had treatment advice to them, but they haven't actually moved ahead with it. And in terms of the inactive ones, the ones that just never come back, 20 to 30% are inactive. And the inactive patient base is a bit of a scary number, because quite often we don't get to see any evidence of that unless these patients are asking for their records to be forwarded on to another location. You may be bleeding people out from an inactive patient perspective without truly being aware of it. So these are all the things that do influence these figures: the longevity of the practice, the percentage of transient, loyal, and perpetual patients. Let's talk about that for a quick moment. It does impact on how much success you are going to be able to achieve at reactivating some of these patients. And so with the transient, loyal, and perpetual patients, these are three categories of patients that you'll have in every practice in Australia. And Amelia and I have identified these three categories. And so it helps us to understand how to communicate with them a bit more, with more effectiveness. Number one is those transient patients. They hardly ever go to the dentist. They really only ever go in when they're in urgent need of something. Even though you can present the need and the value of having recalls or getting further treatment done, till the cows come home, they still won't return. It's just not in their nature. That's the transient group. Then we've got the loyal group. These are the patients that will only ever come to you. They won't go practice hopping. If they've need a recall, if they need a cleaning before a special event, if they need to have an urgency managed, they will only come to you. They're quite happy to wait a day or two to make sure they still only come to you. And then we've got the perpetuals. And the perpetuals are exactly like the loyals, with one difference. The perpetuals come back every 6 months for their checkups and cleans, no matter what. That is how they manage their oral health and their overall health. And so of these three categories, you can imagine that if you were marketing your dental practice in the early stages, for example, this is common, we're open for emergencies, we get people seen on the day, and we just need to get these books filled. You'll end up with a lot of transients, possibly loyals as well, coming through. However, for a very vibrant and long-lasting patient base, you really want to be appealing to the perpetuals, because they're the ones that come back every 6 months. And when you come back down to the financial value of these three categories, certainly the perpetuals are the ones that have that higher degree of value. And so depending on how your practice is marketed, where it is located, what kind of messaging you put out, you'll be attracting more so either transients, loyals, or perpetuals. And whichever one's making up most of your patient base, that will impact on how effective you will be in terms of reactivating some of these patients. So if you were going to try to really encourage a whole bunch of transient patients to come in for recalls, your effectiveness rate will be very low. If you were doing it to the levels instead, it will be substantially higher. Other influences around these figures are the economic factors, what's going on in the world today, high cost of living, etc. So they will less be inclined to have their treatments done swiftly. They may also drop off some of their recalls as well. And also all of the other things that go on in a practice that can influence those sort of figures. All of your practice operations, such as the services that you offer, the hours and days that you are open, the quality of your team and the practitioners, the equipment that you have, the new technology, the physical structure of the practice, the systems, the communication, the quality of care, all the things that you do every day as a dental practice will influence how much of a percentage of your patient base, your database, are made up of people who don't book in for their recalls, don't book in for their incomplete treatment, and become inactive. So we're going to go through 3 categories of people who are in your database that you can discover and try to reactivate within your system. The first one is going to be recalls. The very first step to database discover your recalls, Amina and I always suggest you contact your software provider, because they know how to find hidden things better than anybody else. You just tell them exactly what you want to find. We want to find everybody in our database that is not included in our recall program. And you usually want to put a range on that, but we'll talk about that in a second. So certainly contact your software provider and say, this is what I want to find. What's the way of doing it? And then get them to train you and or your whole team in how patients what needs to be ticked, what needs to be happening in order for them to be maintained in your recall program, getting those 6 monthly reminders coming through, and what drops them out of it and how to find them again. Whenever you do get training from your software provider, we certainly suggest that you record it, because you will forget next time you need to go down this path again. So certainly record it. That's also a good way to get the broader team trained in the process as well. And Meanie, you talk about this first one, search the database for anyone with a recall date prior to yesterday's date, for example.
Yeah, so just say we had sent out, maybe an easy way to explain it, we had already sent out recalls for March 2024. So that means if we were on top of our recall system, everyone in the whole practice on the database that was meant to be in the recall system should have received a recall date up to March 2024, and then the recall date should be post March 2024 and after that. They shouldn't be previous to. Otherwise, they're sort of lost. They're not going to get that further follow-up. So we need to search the database for anyone with a prior recall date, because they probably need to either maybe be made inactive if they've been followed up numerous times and they're not interested in coming back, or they need to be forward dated to get them back into our system to have these follow-ups. And, it can be quite common that a patient has received some reminders and at 6 or 12 months they weren't that interested. They might have been, oh, well, this isn't urgent, that can wait. But maybe when it's been a year or a year and a half, they'll be like, I really need to act on this now. So it is worth giving them a reminder sometime later as well.
And this is one of the things that we find, isn't it, Meanie, that there's, for whatever reason, Dental for Windows is the system that we know very, very well. And their automation side of their recall system, how many times have we experienced that these recall dates aren't being updated, and there are potentially hundreds of patients sitting there that should be receiving recalls that aren't?
Yeah, I found myself using Dental for Windows for many, many years that the manual system, I feel like we had more control over and there was less error, perhaps. I have found now with several clients that are on automation that it was not functioning properly. And so I've taken them off automation. We found, well, Julie was with me in one practice in Queensland, and there was, I don't know, probably hundreds, if not maybe thousands of patients in the database that were just sort of lost. So that could be a very expensive exercise for practices. It can have a huge financial impact. And another thing, alarm bell, is if you were quite busy and your hygiene department or, you know, was booked out for quite some time, and all of a sudden there's this big lull, it can well be because there's something amiss within the recall system. The other thing to look for is searching your database for any patient not seen in 7 months. So do you want to explain that one, Julie?
Yeah. So another thing that I've noticed is that sometimes different team members don't know how to process, the routine. For example, this is a scenario that I've come across often, that a patient will say, "Oh, I'm going to another dentist now. Can I get my records sent over?" Or I'm moving state, and so I no longer need to receive reminders. And so they, within Dential Windows, for example, they go in and they remove the recall date completely. What I'd suggest in those sort of situations is that you just change. You don't say they're never getting recalls again. You just change the recall date to be 00000, because you may have a patient that transfers over to a new practice, but then they don't like it. And they go, the other one was more convenient. Or I've heard there's been a team changeover, new owners now, so I want to try out the new owners, for example. Whatever reason under the sun it could be, but they end up returning. But if they don't have that recall update then flick back on again, they won't get a reminder in 6 months. What if someone moves state for work and a couple of years later they move back, they come back to their regular dentist, but again, because they've been taken out of that recall system permanently, they won't then get another one booked in for another reminder for another 6 months down the track after they return to the practice. And so we want to find all of those patients within a certain range. We're going to talk about a range in a second. We want to find all of those patients that have a previous recall date in the system, because it means they've dropped out of the system, but also those patients that have no recall in the system, because maybe they're not just the ones that have passed away. Maybe there's a number of patients there that have been in since they've had that recall date removed, that recall process removed from their profile. And so this is where it's really important to get the software providers involved, because they're the ones that are going to be able to step you through this very important process, because it can certainly be the case that this task is being manned up by the receptionist or the practice manager. And so the owners of the organisation think the recall system's happening normally, but when you're doing it yourself, that's where you can start to go, I wonder why the number of recalls is reducing down, or I wonder why this, or I wonder how people drop out. And especially the receptionist is the one there with patients every single day, seeing where their next recall reminder date is. And so when they're going into details and they get into the habit of seeing the next reminder date, and it was actually a couple of years ago, it makes you wonder, why did that happen? Then your software provider can certainly assist you in the process, and it can help you refine that whole recalling process and where you put information. Because some practices have been around for decades, you certainly will have a very long list, and a lot of them will be useless contacts to follow up on if you said just every patient that hasn't been into the practice and doesn't have a recall date, or does have an old recall date. There might be thousands and thousands and thousands. So do put a cap on it. How far back are we going to go? And I feel like 5 years is pretty good, because how often do you say to people, it's been a couple of years since your last recall, since your last your checkup and clean, and they say, no way, it's only been a year ago. And like time just flies. And so I think 5 years is a good plan. And that way you're really making sure that anyone who has been lost in your recall system, and time's is flying for them, so they're not contacting you, that's a good point, a good range. What do you think about that range, Meany?
Yeah, I love it. I think you're maximising your efforts, to attract people back into the practice. So
yeah,
I think you go to the effort of doing the exercise, that you try to get the most out of it.
Yeah, that's it. And so you know what you're getting out of it, generate that list so you have, in case you ever need to do a manual tracking of how successful were we at turning some of these patients and reactivating them back in it again, we've actually got a way of doing that. So once you've got your list, where to then? And where to then is you design the plan. And quite often getting some other opinions involved in this is a good way to go as well. Certainly get the receptionist involved, maybe the DA as well, practice manager, all the people. Let's decide upon what our first communication is going to be. If we're going to be sending additional ones, what are we going to be actually saying in that communication, all the things. And so let's step you through this process.
So with recall, one thing we didn't mention, if I'm correct, is patients who don't have a recall date entered at all in their file. So sometimes we have a setting in our software that when the patient leaves, it'll just default or on an 012, for example, or a 114, it'll default the recall date to 6 months later. Sometimes we don't have that set up, and so we're reliant on the front office person or the clinician perhaps to enter that, or it could be hygiene, so it might not be 6 months, it might be 3 months, it might be 4 months, that kind of thing. And if nobody does it, effectively they're lost. They're not in the recall system unless they just remember and they're diligent and they come back when they're meant to. So that is another really important one, to make sure you've got a system in place to make sure that is being done.
Yeah. So if you search your database from 7 months to 5 years, for anyone that hasn't been seen, that will certainly capture them as well. So in terms of once you get in that mindset of a patient that hasn't been returning for any recalls, we don't want to have the mindset of a transient. We can appeal to a transient till the cows come home, they won't return for a recall. But what we're looking at are the loyals that come every now and again for a checkup and clean, and the perpetuals that come every 6 months for a checkup and clean. So they do have a level of care about their oral health. They like your practice. They've in the past they have returned over and again. So just have a think, if I had a dental practice and I hadn't returned for 2, 3, 4 years for a general checkup and clean, what mode of communication? The SMS reminder from a dentist, they don't always read them. They may read the top line and that's about it. And so do recognise the limitations that SMS does have. You may choose to telephone them. You may choose to send a physical letter in the mail. You may choose to email them. Emailing, unless that patient is expecting an email from you, say, for example, we've sent that treatment plan to you in your email, so go and have a look at your inbox when you get home. 30% of people open up their emails. Sometimes it's as low as 13% of people open up their emails. And so if you are going to rely on emailing for this particular project, it may not be very effective. But again, it depends on your client base, because if you've got a lot of busy people, not busy, business people, you're in the heart of the city and you've got a lot of business people who are part of your patient base, they do open their emails at a far higher rate than people who are more possibly rural or out in suburbia.
Julie, we did lose you for a few seconds before.
And just talking about the modes of communication?
Yeah, I think it's okay. I think we've all caught it. Has everyone caught what Julie was trying to say when we lost her for a few seconds there before?
While you're answering that, I'll just quickly mention on the mode of communication, just be aware each mode of communication has both benefits and drawbacks, and they're pretty obvious benefits and drawbacks. So when you're discussing it as a team, think about what's going to be the best way. Emails don't often get opened, and so it may not be the best thing. SMSs get opened at the highest rate, but don't often get read. And telephone calls are fantastic. It's very engaging. You get to have a conversation. They're not always answered, but letters certainly are still, most people do open up their mail and read their mail. And when it's physical, they put it to the side to look at again later. Letters do tend to be a very effective way. And I think that's a very good way for this particular project, but it could be teed in with first an SMS for those that will respond to it, then a follow-up letter for those that didn't respond.
Excuse me, Julie. So just in the chat, they've had patchy audio from the beginning. Quite a few people. So, yeah, apologies for that. Are you being able to get the gist of what we're talking about?
And I'm imagining the recording of this, because I'm recording it in two separate ways, the recording of this may be without the patchiness, fingers crossed. So did you say something else, Meany?
Yeah, so they've been able to get the messages across. It's just been a bit clunky, let's say.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you.
Apologies.
Apologies indeed. The next step is the message itself. What are you going to say in that message? If it's going to be an SMS, you'll be very limited with the number of characters and only be able to fit in a short sentence. Email, letter, and telephone conversation, you can make it far more lengthy as well. And so do think about, what are we going to be saying in this message? Is it going to just be, you've let your recall lapse? Or if we're trying to re-engage people back in that process, could we build that message out and discuss with them how missing out on their 6-monthly general checkups and cleans can negatively impact their oral health? You know, speak to things that really speak to their soul. You don't want to have bad breath. You don't want to have unsightly stains on your teeth. You want to make sure any investment you've made in crowns or implants or orthodontics, that's all being properly maintained and assessed. And so really speak to the heart of the people, get into the headspace of the heart of the people that you're trying to recall, and then decide what that messaging should be. Then we talk about the frequency. How often are we going to be sending something out? Is this going to be a 1-step process or a 3-step process, for example? For this particular one, I would possibly go with sending an SMS, trying to get, and then tracking who booked in from that list that we've got, how many people booked in from the SMS. And then the next step, taking out the ones that already booked in, let's go ahead and send them a letter that describes all the magnificent reasons why they should be maintaining their oral health with checkups and cleans. And then after that, the ones that are remaining, let's try to telephone them and have that conversation with them to find out what their barrier is to booking in. Once we've decided on the frequency, because the more times we hit people, the more chances we've got to have greater success with every additional communication, we will get more and more bookings, up to a limit, of course. When we get many emails about a webinar, it just irritates us. Same with dental. Then we're looking at the interval between each of these communications. We wouldn't, for example, send an SMS, then 2 days later send a letter, then 1 day later make a phone call. What's going to be the interval? And you just reflect on yourself. What would you find acceptable and supportive as a patient? You'd probably send the SMS, then maybe 2 weeks later send a letter, and then maybe 2 weeks later again, or 3 weeks later make that phone call. So decide on the interval as well. Always track. We want to monitor how successful our method has been. So if we're going to, for example, if you've got a large batch of people that you're going to be telephoning, break it down to smaller groups. Batch 1, do the telephone calls and see how effective that is. Batch 2, send a letter. Is that any more effective? Also, the tracking is this process worth our while at all? You may have a practice filled with perpetual patients. And so the number of people that aren't actually actively returning is very small. And so the return on the investment of time, energy, money may not be worth going down this path at all. You're probably in the middle of a range there. And so definitely decide, how are we going to track how many people respond to these communications, so we can, 1, modify how we do it to get better and better results, and 2, determine whether it's actually worth our while or not. The second group is the incomplete treatment group. And again, meaning, we would suggest contact the software provider, because there can be various boxes to tick and lists, active treatment plans that go into how do we find this list.
That's right. And a lot of the time with incomplete treatment, it can be a data entry type issue. So I know with Jennifer Windows, you need to mark the treatment plan either active or inactive. And then in addition to that, you can have multiple treatment plans. So if any of them are marked active, then they're going to come up on your active list, even if they are all complete or all inactive. So you need to be really diligent in marking those accurately. It can be quite tedious getting that all sort of tidy, so to speak. And, different softwares will differ in the management of that. But I think if you've got a really good process, and the thing that I really like too is having your reception checklist really thorough so that you can keep on top of some of these database issues. So, for example, one of your daily duties might be for yesterday, like today, check the previous day's cards to check if the incomplete treatment is marked correctly on the patient cards and if their recall date is entered. That way it sort of never really gets out of hand if it's kept on top of. And then maybe once every 6 months you'll generate those lists to see if anyone's fallen through the cracks, and it should be quite minimal at that point, I would think, if you've got processes in place. So these are some of the things that can help you keep on top of these processes. Generating a list of 5 to 6 months and then defer to the recall after that. So if people do have incomplete treatment and they were in 5-6 months ago and you're following up on that, all sorts of issues could have arisen. They may not have the funds for it. They may not particularly care or be that interested. They may not think it's important. They may not have understood very well. So following up on these patients is very important. And if you feel like there's just a small issue that they haven't understood something or they've just got a little question, I encourage getting them in for, a 10-15 minute chat just to review the treatment plan with the dentist if they're lacking clarity around it, to be able to commit to the treatment. And if not, then defer them to a recall after that. You may not get them back in to have that treatment, but get them back in to have their teeth and gums checked and all those sorts of things, and then we can go from there. Get them engaged again in their treatment, and things may well have changed by that point.
Yeah, it seems silly, doesn't it, if you were going to have people on your incomplete treatment list that you're contacting to say, you had incomplete treatment, you better come on in, and that treatment plan was 2 years old. How committed were we in making sure that patient was actually going to book in for that?
Yeah, and things quite well could have, changed in their mouth, and it's not really that relevant. We've got a whole new path to take. So
that's it. The other step go.
No, you go.
The other step is then to identify the range of services that you're going to include. So quite often we can have things in there such as fissure sealants, which are more preventive. It could be tooth whitening, which is more elective. And so determine, what are we going to be recalling patients on incomplete treatment? Is it going to be active decay, active conditions, or is it going to actually include everything? And also consider what you're going to include in terms of the length of time the treatment has been outstanding, and also the amount of treatment that needs to be done. Sending a standard, you still have stuff in your treatment plan to get done, is fine if it's a small thing. But if that patient had a 3-phase, multiple appointment time treatment plan going, it wouldn't necessarily be all that impactful. There needs to be a more detailed discussion around that as well.
Yeah, and if you're following people up that, perhaps were last seen 6 to 12 months ago, then particularly if it's larger treatments like root canals or crown and bridge, then probably getting them in for a review to see if that's still the path we're taking might not be a bad idea.
Absolutely. And again, generate that list that you can then track and monitor any progress that you're making in terms of your plan. So we go back into the same process, the same way of designing the plan for incomplete treatment. Decide on the mode of treatment, of the mode of communication. If it's going to be a simple, you need to get those Fisher cylinders done or something like that, that could be an SMS. It could be a quick phone call. But if it's a multi-phase thing, multiple appointment times, then maybe an email is sent with all that detailed plan, but also with an SMS saying, we've just sent you an important email, go ahead and open it. Or in a letter format could be very good as well, because depending on the amount of treatment, the cost of the treatment, you may need to include information that may help them overcome potential barriers, such as, remember, we've got payment plans. Remember, we can help you with anti-anxiety or tools to help you be more calm in the dental chair. Remember, we've got outside of hours to help you book in. And so you may want to have that as a bigger message that you send through. So make sure the mode that you're using is relevant to the message. And that leads us then into the message itself. Is it going to be a pretty generic message, or is it going to be very specific, tailored to each particular person? You have 3 fillings to do on your lower right-hand side. This is the cost. This is how many appointment times. Let's book an appointment time. Or is it going to be, that more generic one? How often are we going to be contacting them? Again, reflect within your own self how often would be appropriate for you, and what's the timing in between each of these communications. And certainly we need to track as well. We've got a download that's going to help you do all of this that we're going to show you in just a few minutes. But how about inactive patients? Inactive patients can really make up a larger portion of your patient base than you necessarily really perceive. With inactive patients, they can leave for any number of reasons. Sometimes they're not legitimate, but sometimes they're ones you can't do anything about, such as I've moved state or I've passed away. But quite often they're leaving your practice because of something that's changed, or they're no longer happy anymore, or they're going somewhere else where they're going to find a greater sense of value for. And so you haven't necessarily done anything wrong, but this practice is doing a whole bunch of things right. So reactivating patients comes back down to recognizing there could be any number of reasons under the sun why they have become inactive. So first of all, find the list. Search for all patients not seen in 18 months or longer. 18 months is the accepted industry norm of what classifies a patient as an inactive patient. They haven't been in for longer than 18 months. Identify that range again. Go.
18 months passes very, very quickly. People don't realise that 18 months has passed, particularly apparently through COVID. You're like, what do you mean? We all lost a lot of time. So not writing them off in that time frame, I think, is really super important.
Super important, yeah. So get that range as well. You don't want to be recalling people, from 25 years ago. They have completely well established themselves somewhere else. But maybe, again, that 5-year mark, anyone that hasn't been to the practice for between 18 months and 5 years, generate that list and let's see what we can do with that list. Now, when we are reactivating patients, it is important to make sure that the mode of communication is effective enough to get the message across. Just like incomplete treatment, usually a simple reminder, generic reminder won't be as impactful. The message you want to send out is trying to cover a lot of the reasons why someone wouldn't return. If you've had a change of systems that are more patient-friendly, if you've had more parking allocated, a changeover of team members or practitioners, you're incorporating more health fund, becoming a preferred provider, you have got anything that's changed in the practice for the positive, or that you've managed to remove a negative, you have to do a song and dance about that, because just saying to inactive patients, why don't you come back again, isn't enough if the reason why they've left has been fixed. They need to know it's been fixed. And so make sure the message encompasses that It might also be, the message might be actually a survey. Why'd you leave? We miss you. Why'd you leave? We always want to improve, and your feedback will benefit us enormously, and we'd be really appreciative of it. And so recognize what your message is first, and then decide, well, what mode of communication are we going to utilize when we're sending these messages through? It may even just be a newsletter. This is where newsletters can be very helpful. Keep everyone on that physical newsletter list. They get the physical copy, so they're more likely to hang on to it and read it. And then they are, even though they're not your patient anymore, they are updated continuously about all these positive changes that you make to the practice. And it might be, one so many changes that you go, that's the tipping point, I'm going back and seeing them again. And people don't tend to get upset about you're receiving a newsletter once every quarter or 6 months. They don't get all upset about that. Whereas if we're emailing everybody, every single month, it might get a little bit, they'd unsubscribe, but they're still going to receive that physical mail. And so do think about, again, put your head in the mind of these inactive patients, and what message would you want to read, and what mode would you therefore want to receive that. Again, are we going to contact them more than once? And what's the interval between each of those interactions? And track it. You really want to make sure that you develop eventually a system of reactivating your inactive patient that works very well for your particular area, your particular patients, your uniqueness. And so do make sure that we're tracking. Now, we're just going to look into a download that we've created for you. I'm going to go back to the webinar itself. And this is one of the things that we liked about this webinar platform, but we may not be able to use it, maybe because we're going to go back to Zoom. And so I've got here, I'm going to share it now. There is a database discovery download there for you to use. And Meanie, can you still see my shared screen there?
Yes.
Beautiful. And so within, I'll make it a little bit bigger, but do click on that database discovery download. And this will step you through. Let me make sure you can still see this one, Meanie. Can you see this shared screen?
I can.
And can you still see the download button?
I can.
You beauty. So the way you use this form is, maybe at your next team meeting, decide we're going to be doing recall program reactivation. We've got the list. Now we're deciding what to do. We're going to decide on the mode. So, for example, telephone or SMS or whatever the thing is. Oops. SMS. And then we're going to decide as a group what the message is going to be, dear patient, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then here we're going to say we're going to make it 3 times, 3 hits, 3 communications, and we're going to have 2 weeks in between each one, or maybe 1 week in between 1 and 2, and then 2 weeks between 2 and 3. And then we are going to monitor this by manual tracking, for example. And so hopefully that download will help you develop very quickly a plan in your organisation that you can then delegate this to, and they can go off and run with it. So click on that database discovery download. This will also be shared in our follow-up email later on as well. The other thing that we want to help you out with is diving far deeper into what a successful recall strategy looks like, into how to really effectively manage your incomplete treatment list on an ongoing basis so you don't end up having all of these patients residing in your database without being actioned, and also how to elegantly reactivate your inactive patients. And so we've got 3. I'm going to pop it in the chat. We've got 3. Actually, I won't pop it in the chat because we're not going to use this platform. We've got 3 additional, actually I will, but we're going to be changing the registration links. So you can feel free to register under this platform, we will be flipping your registration over to the Zoom platform. But if you wanted to make sure you took advantage of this straight away, get it off the to-do list and just action straight away. Those 3 links are now in the chat. Successful recall strategy is happening. I'm going to stop sharing for the moment so I can go to my calendar here. Next week, Wednesday, 1 o'clock Melbourne time, it's a webinar on developing a successful recall strategy. The week after, at 12 o'clock Melbourne time on the Wednesday, that's the webinar on managing your incomplete treatment patients in a very elegant way so they don't end up being lost in the system. And the week after, again, 1 o'clock Melbourne time, Wednesday the 20th, that's where we're going to be going through reactivating inactive patients. And so if you are interested in learning more about doing that deep dive into recalls, incomplete treatment in inactive patients, we will be taking you through that 1 hour each. We'll be talking about each of those, delivering to you a whole bunch of downloads, assistance content that you'll be able to use in your own strategies moving forward. Now, as we are winding up, if you can put any questions, anything in the chat that you would like to know about, any clarification about anything, please let us know right now. A reminder that we have had interruption with this platform. We won't be using this platform in the future. We're going to go back to Zoom. We were trying this one out. We had a couple of issues. Also, that reminder, I'm going to go back to my share screen again. It's amazing how quickly we lose things. There we go. No, that's the download. I'll just say it rather than sharing the screen. Just a reminder of going onto our website, dentalbusinessmastery.com.au, because that will really help you determine how we can be of further assistance. You can ask questions of us. You can set up little chats at any time just to get a little bit more information. So that's no dramas at all. So please do put in the chat if there's anything to mention. Meanie, have I missed out on anything there? I'm going to try sharing my screen again.
Done a wonderful job, Julie, as always.
You're very, very kind. No, I don't know how to. Okay, there was a little QR code, but we don't need the QR code to talk about dentalbusinessmastery.com.au. So these sort of webinars, we do try to make sure that we make it as doable as possible. So you're not just left with the information, you've got an actionable step to take. We encourage you to download that database discovery, meet with your team or practice manager, receptionist and owner, for example, and determine how you are going to be able to get these lists and then what you're going to do with those people. Once you get a sense of how many people are actually hidden away in your database, not coming into the practice, you may start to have your eyes opened a little bit about how few new patients you need, but how the existing systems you've got going on can be refined so these people don't reside in the back blocks of your database, but they're all front and center in your appointment book. And when we're moving through successful recall strategy, what we're talking about is how to have a communication with your patients. So they want to come back every 6 months rather than just coming in for another check. They want to come back every 6 months. If with the incomplete treatment management, so you don't end up with a list, that everyone, there's ways that we've got where everyone is just being managed on a daily basis and you never end up with a list of 100 people to telephone call every month. The reactivation of inactive patients, that whole process can be a beautiful and elegant way of identifying what you're doing really well as a practice and what you're not doing so well, making sure you're making positive change within the practice. And so when you're sending out a communication, you're giving them a different experience. And when they do return, they don't think, oh, same old, same old. It's actually a different experience that they've had. So there's nothing coming through on the chat. We certainly hope everyone has gained value from this webinar. feel free to reach out to us. There's a contact us page on the website. If we can answer any questions for you at all and assist you in the process, you will be receiving an email by the close of day tomorrow that will include the recording and the download as well. And we'll also have links to those coming up webinars as well. But thank you so much for your patience. Thanks for putting up with all of those emails that came through to you. We do apologise for that, but we look forward to seeing you all hopefully next week for our next webinar. Thanks, Meany.
See you.
Oh, Kelly's there. Hey, Kel. And there's another Kelly and Ursula. You guys have a lovely afternoon. Beautiful, beautiful. Oh, thank you, Julie, as always. Like your name, brilliant comment as well. Have a wonderful day, everybody. We look forward to seeing you hopefully again soon. We'll just leave that open for a little bit while you're all thanking us because we love thank yous. Thanks, Meany. So that's our next thing, is to make sure that all of our recall strategy, because what we're going to start kind of implementing into our systems now, these are lessons that we've been teaching for years, but you know how ChatGPT can really help us make our messaging fantastic, so that we're going to be building that into our coming up webinars as well. So I'll hit the stop webinar meeting. Everyone, thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you.
Bye.